Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In an historic vote, the U.S. Senate has passed a resolution calling for an end to U.S. military and financial support for the Saudi-led war on Yemen. This represents the first time in U.S. history the Senate's voted to withdraw military forces from an unauthorized war using the War Powers Resolution. The measure passed 56-41. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut co-sponsored the bill.
I think today is a watershed moment for Congress. We are reasserting our responsibility to be a co-equal branch with the executive in foreign policy making. It's a role that Congress has abdicated for decades. And what we showed in this vote today is that Republicans and Democrats are ready to get back in the business of working with a president, and sometimes against a president, to set the foreign policy of this nation.
But the bill is not expected to pass the House this year. On Thursday, House Republicans narrowly passed a farm bill, which included a provision blocking a War Powers Resolution vote on Yemen. The U.S.-backed Saudi war has devastated Yemen. A new report says half of Yemen's 28 million people are now food insecure. Nearly 3,000 people died in Yemen just last month, making it the deadliest month in the past 2 years of war. On Thursday, warring parties in Yemen agreed to a ceasefire in the strategic port city of Hodeidah. In another vote related to Saudi Arabia, senators again rebuked President Trump.
This is now unanimously, the United States Senate has said that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
That was Republican Senator Bob Corker, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. President Trump and a number of top White House officials have refused to acknowledge Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's involvement in the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, despite the CIA concluding with high confidence he was directly responsible for ordering the journalist's killing. Both Democratic and Republican senators have said for weeks they believe bin Salman is guilty. Khashoggi was a U.S. resident and columnist for The Washington Post. He was killed by Saudi agents after entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd, and then his body dismembered. The Washington Post is running a full-page ad today calling for meaningful action to be taken over Khashoggi's murder. The ad reads, quote, "A life is gone. The principles of free expression endure." A 7-year-old Guatemalan girl has died of dehydration and shock while in the custody of U.S. Border Patrol. She was detained last Thursday along with her father and other migrants who crossed into the United States in a remote section of New Mexico. She was brought to the hospital only after her body temperature was over 105 degrees. Cynthia Pompa of the ACLU said, quote, "The fact that it took a week for this to come to light shows the need for transparency for Customs and Border Protection. We call for a rigorous investigation into how this tragedy happened and serious reforms to prevent future deaths." President Trump's 2016 inauguration committee is reportedly under investigation by federal prosecutors. The probe is related to possible misuse of funds and whether any foreign donors received access to the Trump administration in exchange for contributions. Russian gun rights activist Mary Butina has pleaded guilty to conspiring to act as a Russian agent without registering with the Justice Department. Butina has been jailed since July after being accused of trying to infiltrate the NRA and other right-wing groups in the lead-up to the 2016 election. The House of Representatives have overwhelmingly passed a resolution calling for the release of jailed Burmese Reuters journalists Wallon and Cha Sow. The vote came as journalists and press freedom advocates marked the first anniversary of the journalists' imprisonment after they were arrested while investigating a massacre committed by the Burmese military targeting Rohingya Muslims in the village of Indin. They were sentenced to 7 years in prison. In Rangoon, more than 100 Burmese journalists rallied this week calling for their release.
The government's job is not to protect the military. The government is ignoring the fact that it needs democracy to develop the country the right way. Instead, the government is protecting a human rights violation committed by the army.
On Monday, the journalists were honored as part of Time magazine's Person of the Year feature, which was dedicated to persecuted journalists around the world. In Iraq, Nadia Murad delivered a speech to high-level Iraqi officials just days after she received this year's Nobel Peace Prize.
I come to Baghdad carrying the Nobel Peace Prize to say to all Iraqis that we are all victims of terrorism and Daesh, Islamic State, and their blasphemous minds. So I call upon you to act as one confronting your enemy. I come to Baghdad to appeal to the new government to be a national government for all Iraqis, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, and language.
Nadia Murad is a 25-year-old Yazidi Kurdish human rights activist from Iraq. She was kidnapped by the Islamic State, repeatedly raped. She was held as a sex slave for almost 3 years. In Argentina, a court convicted 2 former Ford Motor executives of aiding in the kidnapping and torture of 24 workers during Argentina's military dictatorship in the 1970s. Pedro Müller and Hector Francisco Sevilla were sentenced to 10 and 12 years in prison, respectively. They were found guilty of providing the personal information of workers to military forces, as well as allowing interrogations inside the Ford factory. The case is the first time executives of a multinational corporation were found guilty of human rights crimes in Argentina. Lawyers for the victims have said they may also sue Ford in U.S. courts. In France, police have shot and killed 29-year-old Sharif Shakat, the suspected gunman of Tuesday's attack in the northeast city of Strasbourg, which killed 3 and injured a dozen others. French authorities are referring to Shakat as a terrorist and say he was being monitored and had been radicalized. Shakat was reportedly scheduled to be arrested for an armed robbery and attempted murder charge on the day of the shooting. In news from Africa, President Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, has called on Morocco to finally hold a referendum in the occupied Western Sahara. Morocco has occupied Western Sahara since 1975. No other country in the world recognizes its sovereignty over the territory. In 1991, the UN promised Sahrawis a referendum on self-determination. Since then, Morocco's blocked attempts to organize the vote. Bolton spoke Thursday at the Heritage Foundation.
All we want to do is hold a referendum for 70,000 voters. It's 27 years later. The status of the territory is still unresolved. I've gotten to know the Sahrawi people. I have enormous respect for them. I have enormous respect for the government and people of Morocco and Algeria. Is there not a way to resolve this?
National Security Advisor John Bolton's comments came a week after Morocco and the Western Saharan Liberation Movement, known as the Polisario Front, held their first direct talks in 6 years. The 2 sides agreed to continue negotiations in the coming months. UN envoy Horst Kohler said, quote, "A peaceful solution to this conflict is possible," unquote. Over the past 4 decades, thousands of Western Sahara's indigenous people, the Sahrawi, have been tortured, imprisoned, killed, and disappeared while resisting the Moroccan occupation. You can see Democracy Now!'s exclusive documentary, 4 Days in Western Sahara, Africa's Last Colony, at democracynow.org. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos will cancel $150 million in student debt after being forced to abandon efforts to block a rule that created protections for students whose for-profit college defrauded them or shut down. In October, a judge sided with attorneys general from 18 states in the District of Columbia who sued DeVos for delaying the Obama-era rule. The policy allows for students to automatically have their debt canceled without formally applying for the benefit. And in North Carolina, the state legislature has approved a bill requiring a new primary and election if the state's election board calls for a revote in the contested 9th congressional district race. The race pits Republican Mark Harris against Democrat Dan McCready. Harris initially appeared to be the winner, but the race was never certified after evidence emerged of possible election fraud by Republicans who are accused of tampering with absentee ballots. Politico is reporting Republicans may try to run another candidate in place of the scandal-ridden Harris. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.